But our three talks today are going to reflect on Churchill's time in Dundee as an MP. And we're really pleased to introduce what we hope will be three familiar faces to regular attendees of Abertay Historical Society events. Our first speaker is Dr. Billy Kenefick, who is an Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the University of Dundee. And he's going to be speaking about Winston Churchill and the Dundee Armitstead Lecture in November 1900. So this is another anniversary coming up this week, in fact, because that took place on the evening of 7th of November 1900. After Billy, we will hear from Dr. Kenneth Baxter of Abertay Historical Society and also of the University of Dundee's Archive Services. And he will be speaking about Churchill in the 1918 election in Dundee, on a record victory which paved the road to defeat, the 1918 election in Dundee and its aftermath. And finally, for this evening, we will hear from Professor Jim Tomlinson, Professor of Economic and Social History at the University of Glasgow, who will be discussing his current Leverhulme Fellowship research, looking at the connection between Churchill's defeat in Dundee and post-war challenges to the liberal world economy. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Billy. Thank you.
Right, with 15 minutes, this is going to be delivered. This is the little sort of people. You can see from the opening slides here, what I'm talking about is a series of lectures that were put on by the Abertay Trust from about 1882 onwards. And this particular one was a special lecture for Churchill when he was invited along the 7th of November 1900. He was seen here as a distinguished war correspondent. There was going to be an organ recital, leisure tickets and all the rest of it. Down at the bottom here you can see that the normal price for the tickets was first seats 2 shillings, around 1,500 of them I believe, and second seats for Dundee working men for 6pence. There was maybe 400 or 500 of them. Kenneth can maybe put me right on the actual maximum amount you could get in the Kinnaird Hall. However, on this particular night, if I can get here it comes. This was to be a special ticket. Now, if I can explain this, the Armitstead lectures, you bought the series of tickets normally. You could turn up on the day, but if you were a football season ticket holder, you don't get into the European games, and this was considered a European game. So for that night, there was a special 4 shilling tickets, and this is important. And this very much incurred the wrath of. There's always a lot of letter writers in Dundee, whatever political persuasion they come from. And this was a regular attendee. What becomes of this endowment when we basically phase out the working men from this procedure, because the 6penny seats were few and far between. What becomes of the money, he asked. A quick response to that would be that probably in the region of 250 to 270 pounds was the average that Churchill got for delivering what was one of 30 lectures that he committed to over October and November in his UK leg of his tour in 1900. He then went on to the United States, which was a bit of a disaster. Now, if I could just tell you, roughly speaking, he earned £10,000 for that in total. And then, based on 2020 prices on the Bank of England currency converter, that actually works out at over £1.25 million. So it was a grand old sum, and this is at a time when they weren't paid for their time in Parliament. Churchill's biographers all know that Churchill made a determined effort to bring big names to his lectures, and they are some big names. But the Dundee context came in the form of the popular aristocratic Earl of Camperdown and a host of other luminaries drawn from across Dundee and Tayside society, all of which seemed to be crammed upon the stage that evening rather than be seated in the seats down below. The hall was overflowing. And the Earl of Camberdown was received with great cheers as he rose to introduce Churchill, and his opening remarks stated, and I'm going to miss this wee bit out for the sake of brevity, we'll move on to this. Mr. Churchill, he had come to speak about the war, and no man was more fitted to speak to them and to tell them what his own eyes had seen occurring in South Africa than Churchill. When Mr. Churchill rose to speak, there was an outburst of excited applause. It was a very lengthy speech drawing on the headlines. Churchill spoke of his travels to South Africa, his capture and escape, much publicised, events at Spain Cock, and amongst other adventures, his part in the march from Bloemfontein to Victoria. When the lecture ended, he returned to his seat amidst great applause. The Evening Telegraph published a very fulsome and praiseworthy account of Churchill's lecture, which included an illustration of him, and I'll just show you this. Standing at the lectern on the platform in the Kenneth Hall that night, and as you can see, it's quite okay, dapper. The Telegraph correspondent, our man in the street, as you can see here, reported that his family, like most of Dundee, went to meet Mr. Churchill MP, and while those in the hall enjoyed a organ's recital, I had ample opportunity to observe the audience. I could not help taking notice of the grand manner in which the 4-shilling people swept onto their cushioned seats, provided, as the Earl put it, through the munificence of Mr. Armistead. They were evidently impressed with the idea that the 4-shilling ticket had its responsibility and must be lived up to. He then presented a lengthy and voluble report, noting that he had met and seen Lord Randolph Churchill, Winston Churchill's father, in various places and under varying conditions over the years. And in first observing Mr. Churchill alighting the stage, he was not particularly impressed. But he listened intently. Wait for this, folks. That happily only, I haven't listened to 15 minutes. He then listened to two full hours and reported on Churchill's lecture faithfully in an article comprising 1,700 words. What follows is a heavily edited excerpt from this article, and here we see it again. Mr. Churchill began to speak. His voice, or rather a curious lisp through his teeth, at once recalled the voice of his father. He's gifted with blessed sense of humour and is quick to comprehend what is brightest and best in those he comes into contact. Such a man bound to achieve success as a lecturer, and from the opening words to the close, the hall was hushed. We were indeed all pleased to meet Mr. Churchill, and when I reached the street, I found my brethren there engaged in cheering the youngster who fought and wrought in India, Cuba, the Sudan, South Africa, and who above all had succeeded in pleasing an Armistead lecturer. And more importantly, wait for this, I'll come back to this, in keeping the train and boat people quiet till 10 o'clock. More will be revealed. The local press praised Churchill's performance and the Armistead Trust for engaging in his services in the first place. A reporter known as The Listener, a Dundee Evening Post journalist, was even more enthusiastic in applauding Churchill's evident lecturing and presentational skills. Did never before a lecturer whose year scarce number 30 drew together such an audience as assembled in the Kenneth Hall that night. Never had one of mature age or riper experience more enthralled his hearers than Winston Churchill, with his simple, forcible tales succeeded in doing. When he began to speak, we found he had a voice that was easily heard all over the hall. He had a slight lisp, they all talk about his lisp, but it was not pronounced enough to be disagreeable. He wasted no time in preliminary remarks, but got to the heart of the matter. Would it ever be thus? He noted that the lecture was in 2 parts, with a brief break, but that the second part was as humorous and thrilling as the first. Similar manner, the Courier's correspondent, our man in the street, our listener somewhat gleefully mentioned again the Broughty train and Newport ferry people. When 9:20 came, I looked around and in amazement, where were the Broughty ferry people? Where were the Newport folk? Sure enough, they were present, but they were gazing at the lecturer, apparently forgetting that boats and trains existed. Of all the compliments Mr. Churchill has received, this is surely the greatest. Write it down in the annals of Amstead lectures. We ought to have a medal which we could bestow upon lecturers who could make the Newport folk sit from 8 till 9:45. And then he added, very few people would gain it, so it wouldn't be expensive. Like the Courier correspondent, our listener concluded by citing the high praise of Churchill's address. From grand lecture, splendid man, capital style, and so on. He also overheard one young lady exclaim, "Oh, isn't he nice? I'm quite in love with him." And really, he decreed, "I don't wonder at it." He then concluded, was it really over? Just a sigh of regret was breathed, and then came round the tumultuous applause from every part of the hall. The good folk of Newport and Broughty Ferry evidently forgot the existence of such prosaic details as boats and trains as they stayed to cheer enthusiastically as any city dweller amongst us. Bravo, Winston Churchill. And so ended the musings of our listener. There was one further report of interest from a lady correspondent reporting for the Dundee Evening Post. Her article is entitled, as you can see here, At the Front with Winston Churchill. It's noteworthy for some of the observations she makes about Churchill's quality and character, and that night the hall was crowded. And it was a talkative audience too, until the introduction began to great ovation. For whom? A young fellow of middle height, with a boy's face, calm and pleasant, intelligent and clever, rather than strong. Modest in his bearing, yet self-confidence stamped all over the carriage of a well-knit figure. Winston Churchill MP, war correspondent, soldier, author and lecturer, all of these, but only 26. It was a splendid lecture he gave. He knew every inch of the ground. He covered thoroughly. And she got it right. He actually was 25 at that point. He wasn't going to be 26 until the 30th of November. So the guy who said he was actually 30 got it wrong. Like many others, the lady correspondent carefully identified, and particularly many of Churchill's qualities, as later chronicled by myriad Churchill biographers. Anybody here who knows of Churchill knows of many of those. It is possible too that she read the views of another talented war correspondent, J.W. Stevens, from the Daily Mail in 1898, when he famously described Churchill as the youngest man in Europe. Stevens was one of the first men to recognise Churchill's qualities and characteristics, and his short biographical sketch influenced the thoughts of many future biographers, the first of whom actually published in 1905, It might even have been the thoughts of the Evening Post journalist in a report published a little early in defence of attacks made on Churchill by the Daily Mail while he was in the hustings at Oldham. He reported it as a campaign of calumny and concluded, "This is the great 1900 and may be remembered as the year of Winston Churchill." On that Wednesday evening, those assembled at Kenneth Hall witnessed Churchill's qualities and characteristics for himself. And for those who were unable to attend, there was certainly plenty published on Churchill lectures over the days and weeks that followed. It didn't end until 30th November 1920 on to America, and it didn't end until January of 1901. On the South African War, it would take until 1902 before the war came to an end. For what Churchill spoke about on that November evening in Dundee was merely his description of a 5-month opening salvo in a conflict that would continue for some time to come. And a nice string in
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? At the end of 1918, the outlook for Winston Churchill in Dundee on paper seemed rosy. This is the result of the 1918 general election in Dundee, which was Scotland's only 2-member seat. And you can see there that Churchill's majority over the third place, who was the first losing candidate, was over 15,000 votes. Of the 45 members of the government elected in 1918, that was the highest majority anywhere in the country, beating the Conservative leader, Wynne Law, and the Liberal coalition leader, Lloyd George, into second and third place, 2,000 votes ahead of them. And this was picked up. Meanwhile, many of Churchill's former Liberal colleagues, notably across the water in Fife, Herbert Asquith, were losing their seats. Yet this is not the triumph it appears on paper, nor indeed is it the triumph that some subsequent books have assumed. The 1918 election tends to be glossed over as just a fairly routine one. In actual fact, it was anything but. And it's a long subject, and I've got a limited amount of time, so I will be simplifying some things. But the idea I want to put across is that some of the seeds for what happened in 1922 were sown in 1918, and that what happened really should have served as a warning of what was to come. Now, if we go back to 1910, that was the last general elections, two general elections, one at the start of 1910, one at the end of 1910. Now, Dundee was Scotland's only two-member seat, and as a result, a curious system had evolved. So basically, we had two tickets before the war. We had the Liberal-Labour ticket of Churchill and Wilkie, who were the incumbent MPs, and basically campaigned together at this point. On the other side, we had the Liberal Unionists and the Conservatives, who would actually merge just after the election as the Dundee Unionist Association, and then would be known as the Unionist Party in Scotland until the 1960s. And the third faction, if you like, was Scrimgeour, who was at that point very much operating as an independent prohibitionist. Now, not long after 1910, the relationship between the Liberals and Labour in Dundee started to break down. And had there been an election in 1914, there certainly would have had to be one in 15, but in 14, just before the war, it looks like an election's coming, and candidates had been selected, and it looked like the Liberals were going to run two candidates and oppose Labour. The Unionists had also picked their candidates, so it did look like we were going to get quite an interesting contest. But of course, the war breaks out, and that changes everything. And when 1918 comes around, we haven't had a general election for 8 years. Ironically, as the legislation had just been changed to limit the length of Parliament from 7 years down to 5 years. So what happened in Dundee was, it was basically peace comes along in November, the election's called almost immediately. There probably would have actually had to be an election had peace not come, because the pressure was building on the government. So in Dundee, what happens is the local Unionist Association, its prime candidate, Leslie Bowes, has been killed in the war. So that's a consideration. But they decide that they will back Churchill, who's a supporter of the Lloyd George coalition. They also just interview Wilkie and decide that basically they will back him as well because he seems to support the coalition. The Liberals likewise decide there's no point running a second candidate if this is going to be. So Churchill and Wilkie are effectively running with the backing of multiple party organisations. That leaves another Labour candidate who Wilkie more or less disowns, and Scrimgeour. And because of this, it looks a fairly straightforward fight. But it wasn't. Because there were massive opposition in the run-up to the campaign to what was going on. Particularly, there was a danger that other candidates were going to be nominated. Now, one source of this was coming from the Courier run by D.C. Thompson. D.C. Thompson himself was a unionist. He'd been a member of the executive of the Dundee Liberal Unionists, and thereafter a member of the executive for the Dundee Unionist Association for a few years. But he was unhappy with the government, and he was unhappy with Churchill. One of the big arguments the Courier has is basically this coalition is going to the country. The coalition basically was half the Liberal Party backed Lloyd George, most of the Conservative Party, and one or two Labour members who'd stayed in. That meant things were a bit up in the air, and his argument was they're not telling us what they're going to do. But there was more to it than that. The Courier specifically argued that Churchill is not a good MP. So the campaign starts on the 19th of November 1918. When this editorial appears, Dundee should choose a local member and protest against official autocracy and secrecy. And in this, basically Churchill's criticised, George Ritchie, Churchill's political manager in Dundee, is criticised, and the coalition government has been accused of essentially asking electors to give them a blank cheque. The article argues it doesn't matter that Dundee Liberal Association have done this. The way they've done it is probably not regular. They've endorsed Churchill, but there we go. So what they produce is this list of 46 potential candidates who could run, and they are made up of a number of leading Liberals and a number of leading Unionists, including several former Lord Provosts, including senior figures in both associations, and actually including Sir George Ritchie. What follows in Courier is a campaign that basically takes the line that this is what should go, and picking up on discontent in the Liberal Party. The next day's Courier reported an unnamed veteran Liberal as saying that while he supported the coalition, Mr Churchill had paid scant attention to Dundee and rarely visited the constituency other than when he was looking for votes. Now, who was this veteran Liberal? Well, one possibility is Sir Garnet Wilson, well, then just Mr Garnet Wilson. His father, G.L. Wilson, the department store owner, was a friend of Asquith and a prominent member of the Fife Liberals, and indeed is one of the names mentioned in this list. Now, whether at 33 he could be described as a veteran is perhaps open to question, but it should also be noted at the same time he was writing letters to the Courier stressing the importance of Scottish Home Rule, something Churchill was being accused of becoming lukewarm in his support for, although in actual fact that's probably unfair at this point. The Courier goes on. We get a well-known Dundee citizen who in a civilian capacity had given more time to war interests than a greater degree than any other, who's saying it's a stain on Scotland that so many carpetbaggers from England are coming up and getting Scottish seats, and Dundee should have a local member. Now again, we don't know who this critic is. Possibly could even be D.C. Thomson himself. Who knows? The Courier starts the next day by continuing to stoke the fires. We get this statement that some of the big wigs in the Dundee local Liberal Association are scarcely happy with the way Mr Churchill treats his constituents, again echoing back to that criticism. And at the same time, we've got a number of local Dundee Liberals who would rather have their loyalty to Asquith, and this is starting a split that will continue. There's a lot of speculation in the Courier about people being approached to stand. A prominent man who was from Dundee is mentioned, we don't get the name. One we do know that was approached to stand from the list is Lady Edith Baxter, who was a senior woman in the Unionist Association, but she turns it down. So in the end, no candidate emerged. The last serious opposition, there was a talk of a far-right candidate opposing Churchill. The last serious came, there was continual rumours basically that an Asquith Liberal would put up. And the name constantly mentioned was an actually very, very distant relative of mine, the Reverend William Baxter, who was the former Minister of Gilfillan Church, was then in Bradford, but he declines fairly late in the day, so there's no opposition. But what are we to make of this? Is this just the flames being stoked up because nothing happened? Should we ignore it? Well, no. Because if we look, in 1922, certain things happen that contribute to Churchill's defeat. One is there's an independent Liberal run, and they are backed by Paxton, they are backed by Lord Provost Urquhart, who had been critical of Churchill in 1918 and many had wanted to stand as a candidate, and they are led by G.L. Wilson, and particularly Sir Garnet Wilson. And Garnet Wilson is important to remember in this context as a little aside, because one of the things that's often discussed is why did Churchill refuse the freedom of the city in the 40s. And one thing I think has been overlooked there is the Lord Provost that offered it was was Sir Garnet Wilson, whom he probably blamed for losing his seat. The other big thing in 1922 is both the Courier and the Advertiser turned on Churchill. The Advertiser basically saying he's not a Leo Liberal should vote for Pilkington and MacDonald. The Courier saying he's not a friend of the Conservative Party, Conservatives would be better to vote for Pilkington and MacDonald. So this newspaper opposition was there. He should have realised that Thomson was a problem, that he just couldn't count on his support. He didn't factor that in. Another thing we've got to say when we're looking at 1918 is the turnout was poor. Now there's reasons for this. It was probably the worst electoral register in history. Obviously we've got the fact of wars going on, and indeed the result and the voting was delayed because of trying to get true votes in. But the point is, if you're looking at a 46.6% turnout, which is not particularly low for that election, though compares badly with some of the Glasgow seats where you will get 60% turnout, you can't really say Churchill's got massive support, because when that turnout increases to 80% 4 years later, there's obviously a lot of voters not voting. Were some of them Liberals who were just staying at home because they couldn't vote for a left-wing candidate but weren't prepared to vote for Churchill? We don't know. There's also things Churchill did during the campaign that you could argue were going to come back to haunt him. So one big thing he does is he announces, and newspapers are caught a little bit on the hop by this, at a meeting in Lockheed, that the government is going to pursue the policy of nationalising the railways. Now, of course, that ultimately didn't happen. We got the grouping, which was slightly different, but that starts to make some of the people on the left say, well, is it Irish radical credentials? Can you trust them? He also comes down, and this is one of the reasons why the Courier eventually drops its opposition, as very much the pro-war candidate and pro-a-tough peace. He says this election is patriotism versus pacifism. So Scrimgeour and Sonny Brown, the other Labour candidate, are portrayed as the pacifists. He and Wilkie are the men that are stood up for Britain during the war and are going to ensure that this works. Now, in the immediate aftermath of peace, when still not a lot is known about what has happened at the end of the war, that's going to be popular. Come 1919, when soldiers are coming back and maybe telling a different story, come 1920, when we've had Versailles and the peace that Churchill seems to have proposed is not what's happened, as Kaiser's not being punished, that's going to be a problem. This is the sort of thing. And he didn't help himself, he doubled down. For example, in 1919, he arranged for a special souvenir to be given to 500 members of the Dundee Liberal Association. And this is described as having his election results in the offices he held, but being surrounded by pictures of battleships, surrounded by tanks, him in his uniform that he wore when he was First Lord of the Admiralty. So he has associated himself with the First World War. So if the opinions of the First World War change, he's going to have to own it. 1919 is the first sign, actually, that things are not well. We see him coming to Dundee in May to address the local Liberal Association. Actually, the reason he's up is because Hague is getting the freedom of the city, and Churchill, of course, Hague is very popular in 1919. Churchill's trying to get into his popularity. He's the local MP, so fair enough. But he does hold this meeting, and before this meeting starts, there is a division about whether questions should be asked publicly or privately, and this goes to a vote. And the compromise is some will be asked publicly, but afterwards some of the Liberal members will be able to speak with him privately, and it's clear they're going to criticise him. At this meeting, he is questioned on various things, and there is some criticism of him. But the one interesting one is he's accused of, by backing the government's preference policies for Dominions, basically turning into a protectionist and going against the Liberal creed of free trade. He absolutely denies this, but the idea that he's doing this is there. Now, if you know Churchill's career, that's the reason he left the Unionist Party, was because he was a supporter of free trade. So this is a big turn. We also got in 1919 the AGM of the Liberal Association, where a motion critical of Churchill is passed. Some of the Liberal members say we voted with them for a heavy heart, we couldn't do it again. And not only did they send this to Churchill, they send it to Asquith. And this motion also says they would favour Asquith as Prime Minister again. So basically, they are ditching on the government that they got elected. So this was all warning. The final problem's coming with Wilkie, because Wilkie is by now deeply distrusted on the left. He has no chance of getting the Labour nomination again, and in early 1920 he decides he's not going to stand again. And this immediately alerts Labour. They think this is a good chance, ideally to get two members in, but they want somebody high profile who's going to come and take on Churchill. Because Churchill by now, particularly on the radical left, is a hate figure. So Forward, for example, said Churchill's stock is very low in the Jutopolis, even among the orthodox. This is the sort of thing. He's been described as a warmonger in the socialist press. This is the man they want out. There's rumours that Dundee's going to try and approach Ramsay MacDonald. Now that doesn't happen, but what does happen is we eventually do get two candidates selected. Edie Morrell, big well-known figure for his opposition to conscription, among other things, and R.C. Wallhead, the union leader. Now, of course, eventually, when 22 comes along, Labour goes down to one candidate quite sensibly so as not to split the vote. But the opposition's there. The one last thing I'll leave you with is this little example of bad prophecy. When Wilkie stood down, the Evening Telegraph ran a bit from its London correspondent saying, oh, Labour's think it's going to take a seat, and people are saying Churchill will be in trouble. This is just nonsense. Dundee's a safe Liberal seat. Yeah, never believe what you read in the papers. So, basically, by 1920 it was clear Churchill was in a lot of trouble. The 1918 election was one that Churchill won because of peculiar circumstances. He basically built up a coalition of the left, right and centre, but it wasn't a stable one. Other than the circumstances of peace, this was never going to hold together. So in 1922, he's leaving himself vulnerable to attack from either side. and he should have realised that there were things going on in 1918, and I don't think the 1918 election done need to be looked at enough. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I hope that what I say will follow fairly logically and sensibly on from Kenneth. I didn't know what he was going to say, but I think it does. So this is about the significance of Churchill's defeat, and just to put some numbers to that, and you'll have to excuse, I found it impossible to not have this quote. Just for a number of reasons. One is that, of course, it emphasises that the great and the good were many of them were friends of Churchill's, and they were very upset about his loss, including Lawrence of Arabia. So this is the result, and as you can see, it's very decisive against Churchill. 10,000 more votes. The prohibitionist, Scrimgeour, obviously top of the poll, and the Labour person who Kenneth mentioned, Edith Morrell, second. And the independent Liberal, again, as Kenneth mentioned, one of the problems on the Churchill side was that not all Liberals by any means were enthusiastic, and they did run an independent candidate who wasn't decisive, but nevertheless that symbolises the dissent within the Liberal ranks. And then at the bottom, not to be entirely ignored, of course, was Willie Gallagher, probably the most famous communist in interwar Britain, who did respectably by communist standards in this election. So what was the significance? Well, let me start saying about the significance of Churchill's career. I'm not going to go on at great length about this, but this essentially is the end of Churchill's career as a Liberal. Obviously, he'd sat initially as a Conservative, he'd switched to the Liberals, he'd been a Liberal in Manchester, and then he came to Dundee in 1908, but he never sat again as a Liberal. He did run as a Liberal in West Leicester in 1923, but lost again. And he lost again in a by-election in 1924, and then he actually won as a constitutionalist, which is basically a Conservative, in 1924. You may note that, as in the early 2020s, in the early 1920s, there was lots of political change. Prime ministers, well, they lasted longer than Truss, but there were four prime ministers in just over 2 years in the early 20s. There were general elections in 3 successive years. These are extremely unstable years in terms of parliamentary politics, and I think that's an important context for all of this. So as I say, Churchill could actually fight 3 general elections, and also he threw in a by-election within the space of 3 years. But I think the point just to emphasise is that, so really in terms of Churchill's career, what we see him is moving from, a very working class industrial city in Scotland to the leafy suburbs of London in 1924 and sticking there for the rest of his career. In terms of the Churchill position, there were ambiguities, undoubtedly, as there always are, in political positioning. But in many ways, Churchill positioned himself as the anti-socialist candidate. And you can see on this election leaflet, for example, the liberal and anti-socialist candidate. And that was how he was positioning himself. And an obvious feature of the context of post-war Britain was growing class consciousness. I don't mean by that necessarily socialist consciousness. I think lots of stuff about the revolutionary politics and left-wing politics is probably exaggerated, but nevertheless there was undoubtedly a much greater level of class consciousness generally in Scotland and indeed in most of the UK in the wake of the First World War, and organised working class hostility to Churchill was very much a feature of this election. So, the anti-socialist candidate, of course, who came top of the poll, just to emphasise that point, I mean, Scrimgeour is difficult to deal with in many ways because he is in some ways unique. There has never been another prohibitionist candidate ever elected to the British Parliament. So this is a very strange thing in many ways. And some of us might think it's quite amusing that someone as enthusiastic a drinker as Churchill was beaten by the only ever prohibitionist elected to the British Parliament. The Advertiser summarised him as being of mawkish self-righteousness, ill nature, suspicion mania, and crankism. Now, that's obviously not a particularly favourable view. But if you read stuff that Scrooge said and did, it has an element of truth about it. But he clearly, on the other hand, had something going for it as far as the Dundee public were concerned. And it's perhaps worth making one point that prohibitions, and today we think about prohibition as a sort of mad scheme that the Americans had, and didn't they suffer for it, but actually it was pretty popular. And it's not only popular in the sense that there was quite widespread support, particularly probably amongst women in Dundee, but on the left it was very popular as well. It was quite a common feature of left-wing politics in Britain at this time to be strongly anti-booze. Gallagher, for example, I mentioned, the communist, never ever went into a pub in his life. Never. And indeed Lenin, and Gallagher knew Lenin described him as a Presbyterian communist because he never went into a pub. Presbyterian communist. That's what Lenin thought. Lenin was pretty perceptive about this. He had some interesting comments about Morel as well. Anyway, this is Morel, as Kenneth said, an important figure. After he was elected, it was thought he might well become Foreign Secretary in the first Labour government. It didn't actually happen, but he was a serious player in the Labour Party. Did his election signify something really serious about Dundee's politics? Well, he was the first non-liberal, apart from Wilkie, who Kenneth mentioned, Wilkie tried to stand as a Liberal candidate, and then when he didn't get the seat, he went as Labour. So I think that gives you some sense of where he stood on the political spectrum. So in many ways, I think Morel can be seen as the first strongly Labour person ever elected for Dundee, although he was himself also an ex-Liberal. And it's just again worth emphasising that these kind of divisions between Liberal and Labour are much more fluid than would one perhaps imagine. So really the first mainstream Labour figure elected for Dundee was Tom Johnston, a very important figure in the Labour Party, who's elected when Morel dies, as he does very quickly. Another thing just about Morel, he won 3 general elections in 2 years. So he won 3 general elections and only sat as an MP for just over 2 years. I think he's almost unique in that regard as well. Later on, of course, this doesn't prove to be a permanent dispensation towards Labour, and we get, of course, Conservatives elected in the 1930s. But what I wanted to just to focus a bit on is the broad significance of this. How do we think of it in the sort of bigger picture, as opposed to its implications for Churchill, which is obviously significant, and the implications for Dundee, which are also significant, but what about the bigger story? Well, of course, in one sense, we have to be clear as historians. We don't really know why Churchill lost. There are no opinion polls, there are no surveys at this time, which would give us the kind of fine-grained opinion material that we really need to say that was what really mattered to Churchill. But I think we can get some sense of it. And William Marwick, who is a historian who wrote many years ago about this election, identified the Catholic vote as being alienated over Ireland. Churchill's neglect of his constituency, which, as Kenneth rightly said, was a common theme. He's basically a guy who never comes except for when there's some immediate political benefit to be had. Hostility of the trade unions, which have been growing, and indeed the trade unions have been growing as well. Marwick doesn't discuss the role of women, but women were 45% of the electorate in 1918. Obviously, there was still more men because women only had to vote at the age of 30. But Churchill had a pretty poor reputation in relation, certainly, to politically conscious women because of his wavering over the issue of women's suffrage. And in fact, when the women's suffrage was equalised with men's in 1928 to be 21 for everyone, Churchill was actually opposed to that. So he continued his unenthusiasm for the political role of women. I want to conclude by saying a bit about the economic aspect, partly because I'm an economic historian, so that's what I talk about most of the time, but also because I do actually think it's quite important. Kenneth mentioned Dupotopolis. Remember, Dundee is an extraordinary place economically at this time. Before the First World War, it was arguably the most globalised city economically in the world, in the sense that its industry, its employment relying on the global economy through the jute connection. Dundee is also a pioneer of a major export industry which is being hit by competition from within the empire, from low-wage competition from India. It's a really striking example of something which has become much more of a phenomena later in the 20th century. So how do you deal with that? Well, you can try and protect your industry against foreign competition, but you have the problem that it's not much relevance really to Dundee's problem, because Dundee's problem was in world markets. It wasn't that the Indians were selling a lot of jute in Britain at this time. They were selling jute in competition with Britain in world markets. So protection of the British market isn't terribly relevant. There's also the problem for Churchill that he's actually a free trader, as Kenneth mentioned. He's a liberal, and it's been said, I think probably arguably truly, that one of the very few principles that Churchill stuck to through most of his life was being a free trader, although he wavered a bit about that in the 1930s. And he, when pressed by people in Dundee about this, because there was pressure for protection from both the trade unions briefly and from the employers in Dundee, he kind of wavered about it. He emphasised the difficulty of any kind of protection, particularly if it was aimed at the empire. Because clearly, if you started saying to the Indians, in some sense, we're going to weaken your economy because it's hurting Britain, it's hurting Dundee, you're not really going to find much support amongst imperial enthusiasts. The other issue, of course, key issue was wages. There'd been set up this thing called trade boards, what we later called wage councils, which set wages, which the employers were trying to get rid of because they thought they were holding wages up too high. And Churchill sided with the employers on that issue. He wanted to get rid of these trade boards. And then it was ironic because Churchill had actually been a key figure in actually setting up those trade boards in the 1900s, before the First World War, when he was very much the liberal reformer. But by the 1920s, he'd come out against them. So what you get in the run-up to, remember the election is November the 15th, 1922, the jute employers saying, well, because of the crisis in the industry, because of Indian competition, we want to cut wages by 15%. It's a pretty big number. The trade board then meets and it mitigates that, but there is nevertheless, they agree on a wage cut of 3.75%. So it's important to emphasise then that Churchill was in a sense lining up with a strategy of cutting wages as the way of improving the economic conditions in Dundee. Another thing which he did was to support cuts in relief works, because one of the arguments made was if people can't get a job in Dundee, we should try and provide them with employment in some kind of other activity. Broadly what today is usually called, I suppose, infrastructure or something of that sort. In this case, I think it was particularly the issues of forestation, planting forests. And again, Churchill came out against that because he favoured what was called the Geddes Acts, which was the cutting of public spending by the government in order to deal with the perceived problem of the public deficit and inflation. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like what's going to be announced in 2 weeks' time? Yes, I think it does. So, Churchill moved to the right over his period, particularly across the First World War. But he was still broadly an adherent of what is often called liberal economics, which was shown when he became Chancellor of the Exchequer in the late 20s. He believed in free trade, he believed in wage flexibility, which of course means cutting wages when times are bad. He believed in a balanced budget, so not spending too much money on relief works, and basically on relying on the problem on the private sector to deal with the massive problem of unemployment. So my conclusion, which I don't pretend is an answer to all mysteries here, but clearly it seems to me that one of the reasons that Churchill lost in 1922 is that he had no answer to the problems of Dutopolis as they were and the massive unemployment at the time. Okay, so.